The 1924 bus crash, Poquoson's most tragic day. On the afternoon of November 3, 1924, a group of citizens from the Messick area of Poquoson gathered at Amory's store to catch a bus bound for Hampton. For some of the women, it promised to be a joyful outing. They were headed to select a wedding gown. For David Hopkins, however, the trip carried a heavy purpose. He was traveling to Dixie Hospital to spend his father William Hopkins's final hours at his bedside. The bus was owned and driven by Mortimer Rand, a former Army sergeant from Hartford, Connecticut, who had been stationed at Langley Field. After marrying a local woman, Missouri Bunting, Rand left the service and settled in Poquoson. His small bus line provided a much-needed convenience for residents facing the long, winding journey along Back River Road. At approximately 2:40 p.m., tragedy struck. As the bus crossed the tracks at Back River Crossing, it was hit by a C&O train traveling about 45 miles per hour from Newport News. The collision claimed 11 lives, marking what may have been the greatest single loss of life on the Virginia Peninsula since the Civil War. The victims. Those killed included William Forrest and his son Essie, Gilbert Inslee and his son Floyd, Albert and Waverly Furman, David J. Hopkins, Miss Mary Elizabeth Dixon, and her two young nieces, 5-year-old Nanny Mae Dixon and 4-year-old Virginia Wade. Joseph Huggett was badly injured and died days later at Dixie Hospital. Several others were gravely hurt, including Mrs. William Dixon and driver Mortimer Rand. Miraculously, 2-year-old Alice Frances Dixon survived with only minor cuts and bruises. Her survival was almost chance. Moments before the crash, her mother had moved her from the back of the bus, where Nanny and Virginia sat, to the front. 8 victims died instantly. One of the little Dixon girls passed away en route to the hospital, while David Hopkins and J.F. Furman succumbed shortly after arriving. The aftermath of the crash. The bus was completely destroyed, and newspapers reported bodies and wreckage scattered for yards beyond the site. Mrs. Dixon was discovered clinging to Alice on the train's cowcatcher. She relinquished her child only when rescuers pried the girl from her arms, after which she lost consciousness. She survived but spent 6 months recovering in Dixie Hospital. The coroner, Dr. George Vanderslice of Elizabeth City County, held 2 inquests. Witnesses at the scene claimed Rand failed to stop at the tracks. In contrast, from his hospital bed, Huggett testified that Rand had stopped and looked toward Hampton, but not toward Newport News, the direction of the oncoming train. Huggett recalled warning Rand to step on it. Whether the bus stalled or Rand froze remains unknown. The bodies were taken to Harry Cunningham's funeral parlor, where extra embalmers were called in to assist. Families soon arrived for the heartbreaking duty of identification, while Reverend Charles McAllister of St. John's Church and Reverend Charles Friend of Hampton Presbyterian Church offered comfort. The second coroner's jury concluded the disaster was a tragic accident and urged improvements to railroad crossings, as 6 other lives had already been lost that year in Elizabeth City County. The losses remembered. William Hopkins died just days later, never knowing that his son David had perished in the crash. The tragedy left multiple families shattered. Gilbert Inslee left behind a wife and 4 children. Essie Forrest left a wife and 4 children while also caring for 2 more. William Forrest left a wife and 3 children, and J.F. Furman had been married less than a year. In the days following, the victims were brought back to Poquoson for burial. Thousands attended services from across York and Elizabeth City counties. Out of respect, hundreds of Hampton businesses closed from noon to 1 p.m. on the day of the funeral. Sheriffs Curtis of Elizabeth City and Lawson of York County worked together to manage the immense crowds, while Hampton civic organizations passed resolutions of sympathy. Teenager Thelma Hansford, who attended several funerals, would later recall, well into her 90s, the somber processions. Services for 4 victims were held at the Forrest home, then at the Inslee and Furman homes. Caskets, set in the front yards and blanketed with flowers, were attended by mourners as hymns such as "Someday," "You Will Understand," and "Nearer My God to Thee" were sung by a local quartet. The Forrest family and 1 Furman brother were laid to rest in Weston Cemetery. The other Furman brother was buried at Eastern Cemetery. Nannie Mae Dixon and Virginia Wade were interred at Phillips Cemetery off Wren's Road. The graves of William and David Hopkins remain undiscovered by the author. Community response. In the weeks that followed, support for the victims' families poured in. The Merchants Bank of Hampton distributed $45 to each orphan at Christmas, and Peninsula communities collectively raised $5,000 to aid those left behind. The 1924 bus crash remains one of Poquoson's darkest chapters. A day of joy, duty, and ordinary travel suddenly turned into unimaginable loss, forever etched into the community's memory. If you like this story and would like more, please like to help keep these stories alive. Comment, share your thoughts or ask questions. Subscribe. Join me in exploring our rich history through the people that came before us. Every interaction helps spread awareness and preserves our past. Thank you for being part of this journey.